Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar on impact measurement as the experts. I'm Karim Harji, the program director of the Oxford Impact Measurement Program, and we're so happy again to see lots of interest in our series on impact measurement, responding to many of your questions from our first webinar, where we had a lot of you email us and during the webinar ask about some of the themes and issues that we were talking about during our discussion, which was on innovations and tensions. We decided to host this webinar specifically to respond to your questions. And so thank you all for your participation and engagement last time around. So we just move to the next slide. For those of you that are new to our webinar series, this is a part of a series in advance of our impact measurement program, which runs at the end of June in Oxford. The program provides a range of different exposure to tools and frameworks. We'll also review and understand the different approaches, their limitations, risks, through a range of different applied learning techniques and a bit of a structured learning journey, both in advance of the program, during the week, and post-program. If you want more information, we have the website, which provides a bit of a breakdown of the program, and Annabelle, whose information you'll see at the end of this webinar, can provide more information. So just on the next slide, please. Today, we're joined by three of our core faculty who've been with us since the beginning, really, of the program. And they're here to respond to all of your questions. They bring a wide variety of experience across many different sectors, and in some ways are pioneers in the practice, the art, and the theory of impact measurement from different perspectives. So we're very lucky to have all three of them here today. I'll briefly introduce them, and as we jump into your questions, we'll be able to glean some of their perspectives and experience. I should also say before I make the introductions that please use the chat box function. We're still taking questions as we go along. We'll initially start by responding to many of yours from our last webinar series and what have been submitted by email. And then certainly we'll have a little bit of time to review any additional questions that come up if you'd like clarification or have other questions you'd want to cover. So by way of introduction, Jeremy Nicholls is professor for social value at Staffordshire University. You may know him from his pioneering work around social return on investment. So he's the founder and former CEO of the SRI Network and Social Value UK. Jeremy does a lot of training around social return on investment, social value, social accounting, and he'll be talking and focusing some of his remarks not only on those themes, but also around the big questions around accountability, measurement, and stakeholder engagement. Karl Richter is the executive director of EngagedX, a firm that does some really pioneering and interesting work around data standards, has done pioneering work around impact benchmarks, and former head of research and knowledge at UNDP's SDG Impact Finance team. And so again, we'll talk a little bit about some of the big questions as it relates to data, metrics, as well as impact investing, where we've both spent a bit of time together thinking about some of the big issues and tensions around impact measurement as applied to impact investing. Penny Hawkins is a principal consultant at Creative Evaluation Limited and former head of evaluation for the Department for International Development, DFID, brings a wealth of experience across government and philanthropy, and is well versed in thinking about some of the big questions around evaluation, around measurement, and so we'll get into some of those in terms of thinking about both the opportunities and the tensions and how we can progressively move some of these issues forward within all different kinds of organizations. So those were very quick introductions. You can learn more about each of their work online. So let's just jump right in to the first set of questions on the next slide. And so what we've done for each of these questions, we've provided a prompt for each question and just an initial resource or two based on initial responses that we will provide. Following this webinar, based on our discussion, if you would like more information or have additional questions, we may include that in the follow-up email or in the links below the YouTube video. So if we can just move to the next slide, we'll jump right into the questions. We'll start with some big questions, the kind of macro issues around impact measurement, and we've picked two to kick us off, starting out with the easiest ones, I think. So the first one here is, can there ever be a universal impact measurement standard given the breadth of the industry, and if so, how do we get there? There's a question from Matteo. So I'm going to pose this one to Jeremy and help us kind of at least get an initial starting response to this, and we can come back to some of the themes underneath this. So Jeremy, maybe give this one a go.
Thank you, Karim. So yes, there can be, and yes, there must be. The risk is, of course, to the right one. The analogy I always use for this is finance. We, of course, have one single approach to financial accounting, and we've got enough trouble in the markets, but you can imagine how much more trouble there would be if suddenly everyone was able to do their own completely different type of accounting, rushing around going that they've got the way, and that every day someone else popped up with the way to do financial accounting. And so that wouldn't work. One of the main reasons we haven't got anything like as much impact as we need to have at the moment being driven is this lack of a universal standard. The challenge then is, how do we get to that? Because at the moment we've got, I think, increasing convergence, but nonetheless nothing that kind of holds the line and has some kind of international forum within which updates and changes happen, as is the case with financial accounting. To get to it, well, I think there is a lot that's going on. I think some of the recent moves within the European Commission suggest that if the standard setters don't get there, they will help them and encourage them to get there. So there's now this mix between policy and practice starting to drive that, which will at some point increase the level of legislation. It's not that there's no legislation, but there is increasingly more, and that is not very prescriptive and is very much then setting a frame for which the various bodies that are active in this space converge slowly over time. My view is they're not converging fast enough, of course, and not converging to some of the right questions around impact, but nonetheless, if we don't manage to get there, I think we'll continue to underperform in terms of the level of impact we need to meet the challenges we face globally.
Thanks, Jeremy. We've got a link here to the principles. So maybe for those that are unfamiliar with those principles, which in some sense are not necessarily a standard, but a universal set of principles that could be applied across many different kinds of impact measurement situations or contexts. So maybe you could just give us a quick overview of those.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if you think about, everyone tries to go to the bottom of this and start to think, well, what are the basics? And of course, it seems that having a set of principles within which other approaches, or which the application of those principles in different contexts, different settings, different countries, allows the right level of fluctuation, variation. But nonetheless, you have a set of principles that underpin that. So Social Venture International support a set of principles which are largely around focusing on what has actually changed in people's lives, making sure that you consider the causation of that change, making sure that it's a complete set of changes, and that therefore those people who are affected are involved in considering what those changes are, and that for anyone who is actually seeking to make choices between different ways of allocating resources, where you hope that one of them will have more impact than the other, but which both have potentially different outcomes being experienced by different people, you inevitably need some kind of approach to valuation. And so because those principles are about increasing impact, not just measuring it, they also include valuation. And finally, the issues around transparency and assurance, which we may well come back to. But if people are going to use this information to make decisions, they need the appropriate level of assurance that the information is good enough to make that decision.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. And yes, I think there's several themes there that we'll pick up on in a bit more detail later in the webinar. I want to pivot a little bit and ask Penny this question. Again, I think an important, big question, which several of you I know are trying to grapple with within your organization. So Yuri asked this question of, how do you establish consensus on what impact is across a large organization? There's obviously many different ways to answer this question, but maybe Penny, you can give this an initial response based on some of the work that you've done across different kinds of organizations.
Yes, thanks, Karim. Well, I mean, impact as a word, it means so many different things to so many different people. So it's a difficult thing to pin down. At an organizational level, it's pretty important that people within the organization know what they mean when they talk about impact. So, how do you, Yuri's question, how do you establish consensus on what impact is across a large organization, is a good one, right? So I've been working with the Wellcome Trust for the last few years, a large foundation based in the UK that focuses mostly on health and research. So they decided about 3 years ago that they needed to focus on this question here. What do we mean by impact? How do we know what impact we're having from the interventions that they fund? So so they started a process which was led by the senior leadership team to actually create this shared vision across the organization. Well, not just a shared vision, but a shared understanding of impact and what they would consider to be success in terms of what they would like to achieve. So the starting point for this is often a strategy. They happen to have a new strategy, so that was a good starting point, because there needs to be a link between strategy and impact. So what impact does the organization wish to achieve and or contribute to? So they did recognize quite rightly that what they were doing would be a contribution to these higher level impacts on people and planet that they would like to see. So they embarked on creating something that they called a success framework. To do that and to get this shared understanding, there was participation from all corners of the organization. So it took quite a bit of time, lots of discussion, workshops, and the production of draft frameworks and further consultation. So the question that they were trying to answer is, what as an organization did they want to see in the longer term? So they were interpreting impact as the long-term effects they wanted to have on the world. So this was a successful attempt at actually doing this, and they ended up with an organizational-wide view, which this link would link to. Now, having said that, it's not usually a static thing. So as thinking develops and people get used to thinking more about impact, there's generally a process of continuous refinement as more information comes in, as perhaps they change what they do in order to achieve the impact. So it's, if you like, a kind of ongoing process. It doesn't end, which is quite exciting and quite daunting at the same time.
Thanks, Penny. And for more information, you can visit the link that we have here. Just wanted to ask a quick follow-up, Penny. You've now done this across different kinds of organizations, in government, within foundations. Any words of wisdom, advice, reflections on what it takes to do this well, for those that maybe are embarking on it, for the first time, or are trying to grapple with some particularly challenging issues across their organization as it relates to impact?
Yes, well, I mentioned that in the Wellcome example, this was led by the senior leadership team. That, I think, is a pretty critical factor to whether or not you can actually do this. If it's not led from the top, then you're always going to be, kind of having minor successes in different parts of the organization, but it's unlikely that the whole organization will move forward at the same time. So that, I would say, is a really critical thing.
Great, thank you. So let's move on now to the next set of issues that actually came directly from the Tensions and Innovations webinar that we held last month, and a couple of really interesting and even somewhat provocative questions around impact. And so I'll field again this first one to Jeremy, and this question comes from Cecile, who asked, how can we mitigate the potentially perverse effects of impact measurement related matters? And she gave a couple of good examples around when the use of incentives to think about how incentives could be both positive, but potentially even incentivize some negative or unintended behaviors. And there's a whole bunch of challenges around now we're seeing perverse incentives as it relates to impact measurement, where maybe it influences behaviors of certain kinds that may not be in line or consistent with the long-term outcomes, but maybe are more focused on meeting short-term KPIs. So Jeremy, you've provided also a couple of links around how you can involve stakeholders. You mentioned this a little bit earlier with the principles. So give us maybe an initial response to this question around how to potentially mitigate some perverse effects of measurement as more and more measurement seems to be happening.
Yeah, I mean, it feeds off from some of the things Penny was saying, because you need to get this led from the top to reduce that risk. You need to see it be supported by the organisation. It's a separate issue to the perverse effects that arise from actual measurement per se. But if you're going to measure seriously, then you're going to consider a few things. Some of them will be that there will be some negative outcomes from your work. It's probably quite likely that you'll be having less impact caused by you than you thought, because there'll be other factors that will suddenly come to life. It may be that involving people who are important and actually experiencing these changes makes you realize that there are a whole bunch of other things happening that you weren't managing, and perhaps even that the things that you were so excited about were not considered to be that important by the people actually experiencing them. So there's a whole bunch of things potentially that will arise that, whilst are critical for any organization seeking to increase the impact that it's happening, will nonetheless fall foul of many cultural challenges internally, unless the environment is really willing and up for confronting some of those things. I mean, they lead not just from minor tweaks to programs, but potentially to having to recognize that the whole strategy and your whole underpinning theory of change that you will get to later that you may have built may in fact be completely the wrong one, and you need to go and do something differently. And so the perverse effect of even doing this well is that the organization can go into denial about this, and again it starts getting stuck into a kind of process driven and not actually learning. So the first thing about mitigating it is got to be led from the top. The second bit then is the KPIs that you're going to have in there, I think, have to include some sense of an organization that's actually responding to the data that it's getting, and not going into what is otherwise quite easy to do, a sense of either affirming what we already thought we knew, or finding reasons to kind of push the data away from us, which is well-known cognitive dissonance challenges. So you need to have something in place that mitigates against that. So one, board, senior level support. Secondly, I think some kind of way of measuring the responsiveness of the organization to data, to the fact that, let's assume we are getting the right data, we need then to be actually using it. And if you don't actually measure the response rate of an organization, the danger is that we spend lots of time collecting lots of data, which is either infrequently used or never used, and where the value that's potentially within that data is simply being ignored. Then there's a whole bunch of other perverse effects that come from doing it badly, because if you do it badly, there'll be many perverse effects. You will get driven by, as Karim said, short-term things instead of the ones that really matter to people. You'll get driven by things which are allow the organization to find measures of success more easily, because we will trick ourselves, as we so easily do, that everything's great. We will have a whole range. I mean, there's a whole list of risks. So we could add, actually, Karim, one of the other things on this, the impact management projects risk assessment, impact risk, kind of, that's not really a tool, but it's a list of things to consider, all of which could lead to perverse effects. And that's where the assurance piece comes in, because the danger of doing stuff on impact measurement which actually doesn't really get where we need to get is quite high still. And that external assurance process is probably one of the strongest ways of getting an organization to have to confront its own practices by reference to what are increasingly internationally accepted standards.
Thanks, Jeremy. So maybe talk, for those that are unfamiliar with assurance, verification. There's increasingly, as we'll see a bit later in subfields like impact investing, this desire for independent review, independent verification. Of course, this is not new in the field of program evaluation. So just in terms of what the assurance standard that we've noted here, what it brings to help to mitigate some of these potentially perverse effects.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things just to tease out on that. Firstly, we're all familiar with assurance. Everybody, faces that reality within the world of finance, where all of us are producing accounts in our organizations and all of them get audited. I think that external assurance is one thing, because that's providing assurance to people outside the organization who are going to use the information. What I think gets missed, and which is as critical, is that decision makers within the organization need to have assurance. They need to be brought along. And this is to Penny's point, that it takes time to get this kind of organizational agreement about what's going on. If you don't get that, and you don't have all the people who are going to use the data as part of that journey, then at some point you'll present them with your impact story and some data to support it, and they'll look at it and they go, well, we don't really know. We don't know if it's complete. We don't know if it's accurate. We don't know what the boundaries of it are, and we won't therefore use it. And so that assurance is absolutely fundamental. But there are many ways of achieving that internally, from making sure you employing people with the right skill set to do this, through to having, as I've seen in some small organizations, having some kind of internal audit check of information before it gets to the board. But without it, again, what will happen is that you will find yourself not using the data as frequently as you could do, and that we need to do. So most of the assurance frames are basically there to give decision makers confidence that the information is complete and accurate to the level that they need for whatever decision they're about to make with it. I don't think this should be particularly surprising, really. I mean, it is always seen as the last thing, and people say you should do it later and at the end, and not let's start with it. But you simply couldn't do that in finance because of the level of accountability around finance. We shouldn't be able to do it in impact if we're serious about being held to account by the people whose lives we purport to be changing. It's a no-brainer, really. And there's one of these excuses, again, that comes across that it's expensive. I sit on the board of an organization that's turning over 10 million. It's a social enterprise, and we have all our external accounts, social accounts, audited at a cost of around £7,000 or £8,000 on the turnover of about 10 million. So it's not a cost issue, it's a willingness to do it. I would emphasize, though, Karim, that I don't think assurance and evaluation are the same at all. We wouldn't evaluate a set of accounts in the same way as we'd audit it. I think the issue with audit is that it, particularly for external audit in this case, is that it means by reference to a publicly accepted international standard, which you have to comply with. So it's not like we're going to do an evaluation where the management set the scope and say we're going to look at this but not this. The frame of reference by which you will be tested will be set externally, and everyone will have to play along to that line. And that is that's what gives us that kind of consistency and standard approach that makes the information to external users that much more useful.
Thanks, Jeremy. I mean, there's pretty important set of issues here to unpack, and as we're still building some of these standards out, across subdomains and then more generally in the field, I think it's important to be able to highlight some of these. I think that the issues as they stand today, but also where we'd like to get them to. I think we'll come back to one or two of these themes in a couple of slides as we, just begin to unpack these specifically, also in the context of impact investing. So thanks for that, Jeremy. Let me move on to the next question, which came from Alyssa. So still on the same slide. So Alyssa asked the question of how can we measure impact when impact is difficult to measure? And she gave the example of the field of language revitalization and how to ensure that local languages remain strong for future generations. She made this distinction that, when we're talking about language in particular, you may be able to measure the number of speakers, which itself is quite challenging, but also there's a broader set of issues around what really counts when we think about language revitalization versus simply one KPI that suggests how many speakers are still actively speaking it. You have to consider the context, you have to consider some of the broader issues around how you count those speakers and what it means to be able to actually speak a language, etc. So you can appreciate, as a broader set of questions, many of us struggle with this when we think about how do we value certain things, and are those things the most valuable for the users or stakeholders that we're trying to address. So maybe, Penny, I'll ask you to give us an initial response to this, just based on some of the things that you've seen, and I know you've got a specific example there around language as well.
Yes, thanks, Karim. Again, another great question. How do we manage to measure things that are difficult to measure? So I think I'll stick to this example because it's a good one. So one of the things about something like language, and I also have to say I'm definitely not an expert in this area, so I'm going to give more kind of from the measurement angle. So language revitalization is not a short-term impact. I would characterize it as a long-term goal or impact. And the other thing, and it shares with other difficult to measure areas, that often the research and evidence is lacking. So we don't already know enough about how this language revitalization actually happens. And it could be different, it's likely to be different in different places, different cultures, different geographical locations. So you're starting from a difficult point in terms of measurement. And, you know, as the question says, it's also a moving target. So I think one of the approaches for this is not to sort of jump on trying to measure the impact straight away. So start by focusing on what the strategy is, what the plans are, what the activities are initially, and those things are much more easily measured. Not losing sight of the long-term goal. So what are the changes you'd expect to see? What's the impact pathway look like? And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the webinar. But there are probably incremental changes that can be identified with key questions about them and how you might track change over time. So point taken about, you know, if you jump straight to how many speakers are there, you're talking about quite an expensive set of things to measure. So so you might want to kind of move back from that, unless you're able to do expensive large-scale surveys of the population, probably at government level, but if that can happen, that's great. But how is language valued and by whom is it valued? It's often possible to consult with different parts of the community, maybe through things like education service or whatever, but it might be possible actually to at least get some qualitative idea around the extent to which the language is valued. And then aiming for a sort of continuous process rather than, you know, as I say, jumping to the long term. So if you focus on the strategy, focus on activities, are things tracking in the right direction? And what in the environment or in the context is supporting this move? What would you need to see in order to see a language that you could describe as revitalized, that is a vibrant living language? What would you need to see in the environment, as well as you know, how the language is valued? And then tracking this change over time, you know, because if you say that it's probably it's going to be more than one generation, it'll be 1, 2, 3 generations to see the language where you'd like to see it. So just to summarize, it's basically don't start with jumping to impact, but keep the impact in sight and see what else you would need to look at that would support what it is that you're trying to achieve, and try and measure that.
Thanks, Penny. I mean, that really kind of important and complex set of issues, but I think a nice lead in also to our next set of questions where we can elaborate a little bit more, which came in around, you know, impact measurement approaches in practice. And so we've got a couple of questions from Francis as it relates to theory of change. So just on the next slide, you know, Francis asks, having a relevant and thought through theory of change, you know, is important, but how do we provide a way to be able to have this be useful without being too complicated, but, you know, still representative of the situation? So maybe Penny, just to build on some of the themes that you started to talk about, maybe, you know, many of our listeners will be familiar with theory of change, and we've got a couple of links here. Let me just talk a little bit about the contribution of theory of change to some of the issues you described earlier.
Yeah, so the first thing that you know, that comes to mind here is what is theory of change useful for? And not everybody calls a theory of change. It might be called an outcomes framework, an impact pathway, but it's all more or less talking about the same kind of thing. So it's pretty useful if you're trying to design an intervention of some sort. So it enables you to think through the process in a logical way and keep track of what you're trying to achieve and how you think it could be achieved. So that's a design process. It's also can be useful for communicating with groups of people and reaching some sort of shared understanding about the vision or the desired impact. It's also useful for monitoring progress towards the impact. So as I talked about in the previous example, it gives you, it's not exactly a roadmap, but it just gives you a way of keeping track of how things are going. Also, it's useful for generating the kinds of questions that you might want to answer through measurement and evaluation type activities. So also for identifying the kinds of indicators that might be relevant and useful and the sorts of measures that go along with that. So it's really a framework that can be useful in a whole load of different ways. So in terms of when you might start to do it, well, you know, I talked about design, so the earlier the better, actually, because often what's tended to happen in the past is it's only when you get to the measurement piece do people think, hang on, what are we going to measure? And then you have to go back and develop it. So if you can do it up front, that will save a lot of time down the track. Whether or not too complicated, well, there's it's quite useful to have different versions of this for different purposes. So for communicating with different groups of people, different audiences. So generally, you don't just, you know, just a diagram on its own is not usually sufficient. Not everybody relates to visual representations, so it's important to be able to tell a story as well, to have some kind of narrative that explains that diagram, but also what other factors are going to affect what's going on. So the assumptions that you make in developing a theory of change, it's important to articulate those quite clearly. And then you can have a simple version for a communications tool with perhaps audiences that don't know much about what it is you're trying to do, and then a more complicated version when you get to the measurement piece where you really do have to have a lot more detail. So it sounds like a lot of work. It is quite a lot of work, but in the end, it's generally worth it if it's done well, that is.
Thanks, Penny. And what we've also done is included a couple of resources there from John Main. And these are, I think, two particularly good articles on building useful theory of change models, as well as building robust models. And the second article, there's a series of questions that you could use to actually test also your theory of change around whether it's understandable, coherent, and how the linkages come together, etc. So these are also resources that help you maybe stress test your own theory of change. And as Penny said, sometimes you need to build different ones for different uses. It's most important that it is used to inform your decision making, to improve your level of communication and accountability, and also to think about this as an ongoing, iterative, and dynamic process rather than a static one.
And Karim, I also forgot to say that actually it needs to be a group process. So it doesn't tend to work so well if you just try and do it on your own sitting at your desk. So it's involving other people through a facilitated process tends to get the best results.
Yeah, good point. And again, having the curation and facilitation of both the process as well as the product itself is particularly important when we think about theory of change. Francis had another really interesting question, and this does come up quite a bit when we think about this distinction between measuring, let's call it the long-term outcomes or impact of services, compared to short-term feedback perhaps around the quality of use of the services. So we're beginning to see this distinction between what might be called outputs and outcomes, but also really around feedback and long-term outcomes. What are the ways in which we could use those perhaps as proxy measures? What are the ways in which we could triangulate different kinds of data? So maybe Penny, initial response to this question from you, and then I would just say before that last year when we did our webinar series, we do have links here to a couple of webinars where we had profiled a report on self-reported data for impact measurement, where there's some really interesting questions and a resource around how you can ask questions on feedback, and the webinar walks through some of that. So for those of you that are interested particularly in this question, We've covered this topic in a lot more detail previously, but maybe Penny, if there's any additional things you'd like to add just to respond to the question and maybe make some distinctions around, you know, feedback versus impact.
Sure. Well, let me just start by saying that this really gets to the heart of some of the issues around measurement. So if we're talking about, you know, can feedback on quality use of services be more useful than trying to measure the impact of those services? These are two different things in the way I think about it. So quality is one dimension, and quality, the way I would define looking at quality of a service is basically what's the intrinsic value of that. So sure, you can measure the quality of service and people will give you feedback, they may be happy with the service, but then the big question is it actually doing what it's supposed to do, or is it doing the kind of is it doing people the good that that they need it to do? So basically, you can say yes, it has merit, it has intrinsic value, but it's naturally not the right thing to do. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. In terms of the impact, the difference with the impact, that's where you get to the actual value, or the value or the impact on people's lives. So what's the difference that it's making to people's lives or the planet or environment or whatever? So if you can see, these are two different things: the intrinsic value and then the actual worth, the value of the changes that may happen in people's lives. So it's important to keep those in mind. Is it doing things in the right way, or is it doing the right things? So quality measurement is good for improving delivery. That's absolutely fine if that's what you need to do. But the impact, looking at impact, these two things go together is where I'm coming from here. So it's not one or the other, it's both. So impact measurement, this is looking at whether or not the intervention is resulting in the benefits or not, because you also want to find out if it's perhaps doing harm rather than good. But that's a whole area to go into on its own. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, Karim, just making the distinction and saying these two things go together.
Yep, and I think it's a particularly important one, and sometimes these nuances get lost when we use the broad term impact, which is, you know, as we get more and more interest and it becomes more mainstream, we're seeing that some of these concepts get conflated around feedback or even using proxy measures for short-term change to imply that they're the same thing as making judgments on the long-term effects on people and planet. And as you said, it's important to think about those because they are different, but also they can work together to help paint the story of what was intended to happen, who judges those effects, and to the extent to which you can make some judgments on what you should do in the future rather than just look back. So let's move on, because I think there's a lot more to cover over the next couple of questions. So just on the next slide, we're going to unpack a few questions around impact measurement and management as it applies to impact investing. So I'm going to ask Karl to respond to a couple of these questions, and just to note that we have covered some of this topic in detail last year through our webinar series, and also our next webinar in a month will cover some of this in more detail, while we'll be reviewing with the GIN their recent IMM survey and some of the findings and implications from that. So we'll try and give some initial responses today, but also stay tuned for the next webinar in a month, which will get into this in more detail. So Karl, let me pose a couple of these questions to you, and feel free to combine your responses. So we've got Yeri, who asks about some of the best practice guidelines, principles, and frameworks, and also how do we get investors more comfortable with using impact measurement metrics. And then we had a question from Karen around, there's a growing set of frameworks and tools. It's perhaps adding some confusion to the market. And then particularly around the relationship between risk mitigation and ESG versus those that are measuring positive impact. There's a whole series of issues here. So maybe help us get started around some of these questions of things that you might respond to as it relates to these questions.
Thanks, Karim. The start is normally to take a step back from a very specific question, like asking what are the best metrics or frameworks, because I think the more important issue is to develop a deeper understanding of why impact management is important, or why somebody is embarking on that journey, and particularly also in the investment context. Why is it relevant for the deal? And building on some of the earlier comments, I think it's true on the one hand that there's no regulation, or there's no single legal framework for measuring impact, and so as a result of that, we're currently in a context of a very noisy and cluttered field. But that doesn't mean to say there aren't emerging, let's say, lines of clarity. And the first is that there is a very clear single process for measuring and managing impact, whether that's evaluating a program on the one hand, or whether that's evaluating an investment deal on the other. And although they might be described in very different ways and using different language, it is ultimately the single same process, which reinforces some of the points earlier on about saying we can get towards a convergence of standards. But in the same way that when it comes to things like financial reporting or financial accounting, depending on the context, whether it's, say, a small or micro business or a large listed corporation, there will be different levels of intensity in terms of how impact management would be deployed. And I think in that context, it's really important to first of all understand how intensively do we need to manage impact in this particular context. Are we maybe constrained to the extent that based on the departmental function that we sit in within a bank or an investment institution, that there's very much more strongly a compliance mindset and a commercial risk management mindset, in which case you'd probably be drawn towards those tools and those frameworks that are a little bit more prescriptive and are less ambiguous. In other words, there's a single result that is correct, and it's a little bit more binary in that context. Whereas on the other hand, if you're getting into a very nuanced and detailed situation, then it lends itself to exercising value judgments and looking at the different experiences that are had by different stakeholders and so forth. And I think once one sets out that landscape and understands where in terms of the process one is, and also how intensively you're working, you can start seeing which frameworks and tools are more relevant, and maybe also identify those ones that are maybe a little bit more advanced. And maybe from there we can touch on the point about helping investors to become more comfortable with impact management. I think on the one hand, there are many investors who are very comfortable, and so it's certainly encouraging. But I would say if investors are uncomfortable, then it might be that if they feel that this is a foreign idea, then we probably need to just backtrack a little bit and go back to where the investors are and build up the knowledge from that point. And so if we see this as really a layering exercise, then we can build up those levels of intensity. And we see that in terms of the different tools that are out there. So if you look at something like SASB, the Sustainable or Standard for Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, it's quite a rigid approach. It focuses on financial materiality as your entry point into identifying, based on your industry and sector, what are the relevant issues and metrics. Whereas on the other hand, you might have very much more engaged approaches, focusing on a theory of change, and that's your entry point to identify which indicators and metrics are relevant. And what we found in some of our other work and trying to build some teaching material around it is this the separation of, on the one hand, a mindset of compliance and commercial risk management, and on the other hand, a mindset of value judgment also manifests in other writings. So, for example, we see the European Venture Philanthropy Association talking about investing with impact, in other words, with maybe a compliance mindset, and distinguishing that from investing for impact, which is, you know, being able to go that extra level, or maybe being able to use the value judgments. And I think, you know, where we also are is to realize that if we maybe just pick up on this point of financial materiality, there's a distinction between those aspects of impact and sustainability that are relevant for the financials, and basically it's a matter of increasing the field of analysis, but ultimately trying to understand impact in terms of how it has a consequence on the commercial performance of the investment or the business. And on the other hand, there's the idea of deeply understanding the non-financial consequences of economic activity. And I think there we're seeing a lot of interesting research and work. It's certainly under the surface of work that the European Commission is doing with the new EU taxonomy, also the UN Environment Programme with their positive impact work, where they're going a little bit more deeply into understanding how different types of economic activity have fundamental bearings on certain impact areas. And so that also, you know, as those pieces of information are published and those frameworks are published, I think that can be quite helpful for, particularly for people who are, you know, new to the topic of impact management, don't know where to start. You know, you can start then by looking at your industry, your sector, and saying, well, you know, if we're in a mining sector compared to a healthcare sector, we have, you know, materially different impacts based on that economic activity.
Thanks, Karl. I think that, I mean, that was really, you know, good set of responses to some of the questions, and I think, you know, related themes. We spend, you know, a good part of our week during the program on trying to answer many of these questions, and I would just maybe add to that and to pick up on things that were said earlier by Penny and Jeremy as well, in that there's certainly, you know, no shortage of guidelines and approaches. You know, we're seeing also some consolidation, some convergence, or at least some interoperability between these different approaches. And we've got the link there to the Impact Management Project. Again, for those of you that have followed this series, we've had a couple of webinars on them last year. That has, I think, done a lot of good work in trying to bring together different parts of the industry around thinking about common language and how these different tools, approaches, frameworks come together in a way that reduces investor fragmentation and promotes cohesion. There are now increasingly many easy starting points for investors, and Iris Plus with the revamp, I think, has gone a long way to helping even those that aren't doing impact management right now to get started, including more financial first investors. And as we said, in a month, we'll be talking about some of this in a bit more detail around what are investors using today, what are some of the themes, questions, challenges that we see based on some of the data that the GIN IMM survey has put together. And we've got the link here to this recent white paper from the World Economic Forum, which in a sense is, you know, almost like a compliance focused, ESG focused approach to thinking about metrics and KPIs. But, you know, as Karl and Jeremy and Penny have all pointed out, to think about how you balance this with the different stakeholders, because particularly in this case, asset owners might be one of those stakeholders, but not certainly the only one. And so to think about the range of different stakeholders and what impact might mean for them continues to be one of the challenges. We've already covered some issues around how to think about feedback and stakeholder perspectives and universal principles, which are important to also layer into this. And as a final point, just for those of you, again, that are interested in following this specific topic, the IFC's new impact management principles, for which we're beginning to see early disclosures around, are also providing us with a bit more transparency, hopefully, around how to think about these questions across different kinds of asset owners and asset managers. So just on the next slide, to build on some of these themes and talk a little bit more about IMM in practice, this is a really kind of important set of questions that comes up quite regularly. So I'm going to maybe pose this initially to Jeremy around this question from Gustavo, who talks about how do we align expectations and processes between investors and investees, including for-profit and non-profit entities, in order to maximize efficiency and utility. And we hear this a lot in terms of sometimes there are big differences between what investors are seeking versus investees. So Jeremy, any initial responses? We've included here the resources around feedback loops. Again, a topic that we cover more extensively within the program, but Jeremy, maybe initial comments and reactions to that question.
Well, I think it's a great question, and it goes to the heart of why, to be honest, I think that a lot of the way in which impact management has developed has been the wrong way round, basically. It all goes back to the problem of a lack of accountability, that the people who are supposedly benefiting from these things that we call social impact or environmental impact do not have generally the ability to hold the organizations delivering that to account. They may have some partial influence, but the level of accountability that you'd have if you were to compare it with stock market investors, for example, is very, very low. And that means that the ecosystem is not responding to that accountability at the rate that it should. And yet at the same time, we're putting money into these things, and we need to know whether that money is having any effect. So we've built these models, which investors then have in order to show that they've had an impact. And then they need, obviously, the data from the investees. And so they go down to the investees and say, well, this is the data that we need. And the investees look at that and go, well, this has got very little to do with my business model or my process. But if you tell me I need to provide it in order to make sure I keep the finance flowing, whether that's grant, loan, or equity, then I will go away and do my best to get to that, whilst at the same time complaining that it's very expensive and very difficult and there's so many ways out there. If you turn that the other way around and actually had a level of accountability, then the enterprise at the bottom would be responding to what it's hearing from people whose lives it's affecting. Now, some of them are maybe commercial customers, but as we were talking about before with Karl, that leaves out all these other consequences of business action that we need to start managing more effectively. And so you start to get the businesses thinking, well, we need that data as well in order to be able to manage our business more effectively. And then if they're using it, they can report to the investor what they've been doing with data and how they've been using it and give examples of it. And the examples that they would then provide would be kind of impact data information, and the culture would be showing that it is responsive, and there'd be far greater alignment between the people whose lives that we're trying to change, who are not ironically listed in this question, but they are the fundamental one. The investee who's delivering services to those people in one shape or another, either directly or indirectly, and the investors who are putting money into them. And we need the principal agent relationships along that spectrum, along that value chain to be aligned, which they're currently not. And so partly I think it requires investors to kind of turn their head around a bit and go, what are we really interested in? Are we interested in organizations that can go out there and spend a lot of money getting an evaluation done that proves their impact? Or are we interested in organizations that are actively and relentlessly seeking to get from data opportunities to increase the impact, the positive impact that they're having on people's lives? And of course, there's a mix, but we're well away from the latter. So we need to shift it that way. And then I think also there's a requirement for some legislative shifts that we're slowly seeing in terms of fiduciary duty, in terms of company reporting requirements, in terms of director reporting requirements, which are slowly moving towards some kind of alignment, which would raise the bar and have consistency and therefore align both expectations and processes. But please, I would ask that we include investors, investees, and the people who are actually experiencing impact in this list.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. An important, I think, set of issues there, and certainly to make sure that we're considering all those groups in tandem and the relationships between them. And just in terms of the resources, there's additional things here that we could add, and certainly some of the tools and resources available through the two sites here. Also, we won't have time to talk about this today, but Penny and I have spent a lot of time thinking about how you use the tool of theory of change to manage some of these expectations and processes across an investment lifecycle, both with investors and investees, but also with some of the users and other stakeholders within a process as it relates to an investment. So I think there's a lot more to cover here that we're going to run out of time for. I'm going to ask Karl, just on this question around the SDGs, we're almost at time, but we have one more important question I think we want to cover. So Karl, maybe a quick response to this question around how to connect IMM to SDGs, and particularly early stage companies and the SDGs. We've got a couple of links here that are good starting points, but maybe to jump in with a quick response before we do our final question.
Yeah, and the fuller question in our notes, I think, also was looking specifically at the SDG Action Manager, and I think you know, that is something run by the UN Global Compact, where the audience is large scale corporations, and I think we can use that to really emphasize that small scale organizations and startups may need to look in a different place, and sometimes those larger tools may seem overwhelming. And for a small organization, I would say that you know, impact management starts with a company mission, which is part of Business Management 101, and a well-defined company mission will already have the clues for a theory of change at a high level. It will start talking about the activities that the organization is involved in. It will talk about potential outputs, you know, stakeholders, USPs, and potentially outcomes. And I think when you then layer in a basic SWOT analysis, you're starting to build the foundations for looking at and understanding where your unintended consequences might lie and what you might need to think about in terms of managing those. And so I would say that when it comes to impact management, it really can be part of, you know, integrated into what an entrepreneur would do, or a group of entrepreneurs, as they are developing their business and their business model, and really identifying what is the management information that they need internally to build a successful company. And then look at articulating that in terms of maybe, you know, structuring it according to more, you know, recognizable impact management data and financial data. But it's really about management information that's required for the success of that organization.
Yeah, and we can, again, we did a webinar on this last year, and we can maybe spend a bit more time on this in terms of additional links. You know, we've got a couple here, including To Common Approach. Others include the work of Business Call to Action, which is doing some good work in this area, as well as Venture Better, which has some additional tools and resources. So we can include those in our follow-up. But I just wanted to get to our final question, which I think is important and fundamental one as it relates to our program. So just on the next slide, we had the question from Morton, who asks about this really, you know, important set of issues that often we talk about measurement and the tools and the techniques and almost the technical aspects of measurement, and don't spend enough time on the human management side of things to make impact measurement work in practice. So just as we kind of wrap up the kind of last question, I'm going to ask Penny if you can respond to that question in terms of this distinction between focusing on the technical question of measurement versus the people question and the human question of measurement.
Yeah, yes, that's an important thing as well. Let me just take a kind of almost like an ethical angle on this, the issue of ethics and data. So there is quite a lot now of guidance around on responsible data. So what does that actually mean? So always remembering that, you know, the data is, unless it's physical measurement, if it's social impact we're talking about, the data comes from people. So it's to be responsible about this and to be ethical about it, it involves looking at how the data is collected, what data is collected, how it's used, what's the purpose of collecting it, and who has access to what data. So you know, there are rules around this, GDPR in Europe, etc., and other types of guidance and rules. But the central thing here is that just because you can collect data doesn't mean that you should. So I've seen instances where, you know, people will generally collect far too much data for the purpose for which they need it, and then, you know, I guess behind that sits keeping in mind the sense of respect for the people that provide the data. So all of those questions I mentioned earlier, but also making sure the analysis of the data is good quality, because that does respect the people that have given you their time, their effort to actually provide the data in the first place. So that's, there's a whole lot more involved in terms of ethics and data, but those are just a few quick pointers because we're close to time.
Thanks, Penny. And we've got a list here on the responsible data site from Merle Tech, which is important also for others who are thinking about these issues, as Penny alluded to. So maybe just to give a quick thoughts, Jeremy, how would you respond to this question?
Lost my muting button at the moment. Yes, I think we do. I mean, I look back now, I've been doing this for far too many years, and I've been involved with a social enterprise for many of those years, probably about 10, I suppose, from the beginning of its journey. And when we started reporting and reporting externally, but also thinking about collecting information about what I think we called social accounts initially, we did it at levels of rigor and complexity, which are probably way below what we're currently all talking about. You know, there's no doubt that the field has evolved, but we've evolved, if we're not careful, to be on the top of a pin of very detailed arguments about technical things which are sometimes absolutely necessary, but actually for many of the decisions that we could have been making with the data, not certainly at that kind of level of small operational improvements that we could make in order to enhance the impact we're having at a relentless level. It's almost as if that's got in the way. It's certainly that I would wonder whether we could say, despite that increase, are organizations now creating that much more impact for the resources they're expending than they were? You know, so Joe is probably a bit out. So I do think we need to go back to some of this, you know, data management issue about getting some data and having people with the skills to analyze and interpret that data for what insights it gives us, what options are there to improve data, and some of the entrepreneurial skills which can then put those options and ideas together in ways that are actually going to be viable, whether that's grant funded or commercially funded, whatever it is, but it needs some kind of viable model to support the application of resources against those options. I do think we need to get back to that, and that goes back to this earlier point around, you know, shifting the focus from measurement of perfect impact to measurement of people actually responding to the lives of people who they say they're impacting, and doing less bad over there and doing more good over here.
No, thanks. I think really important reminders as well, and part of what we emphasize again through the program as well and the week. So Karl, maybe final comment from you on this before we wrap up.
In terms of the human dimension, I think it's probably worth emphasizing that impact management, specifically for companies new to it, is really a change management agenda as much as anything else. And so linked to that, one should also be mindful that it probably is going to be iterative in terms of engagement. It's about building awareness, building the knowledge base and the expertise, and really ultimately a deeper understanding of why impact is important for that organization and why it should be taken seriously.
Great, thank you. And you know, we are running about you know, out of time, so you know, we didn't have as much time to cover this as we would like, but certainly there's more to talk about on this specific question, and we look forward to doing that in a future webinar. I just want to wrap us up, and just to say that, you know, we cover a lot of these kinds of issues within the week. As it relates to the program, we're going to try and push out a few more resources when you get the webinar recording in the next week or so. We do have a handful of places still open for this year's program, so please get in touch with Annabelle if you'd like more information or have any questions. And we also welcome any additional questions that you have on these topics and themes, because it's been very helpful for us to see the kinds of questions and hopefully give you guys some initial starting points and resources to react to. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers today. Thank you, Penny, Karl, and Jeremy. We really appreciate your time, wisdom, and resources. And for those of you that have been on the webinar, thanks so much for your participation. Please get in touch if you do have any additional questions. And we look forward to seeing you on the webinar, the next webinar in a month. Thank you.